When you think about the fall of Rome, what comes to mind? Probably these epic ruins, right? A story etched in stone, of a civilization so vast, so powerful, it seemed like it would last forever. But what if that story, the one we all think we know, is basically a lie?
I mean, what if this powerhouse, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, wasn't actually murdered by outside forces? What if it committed a kind of slow, agonizing suicide?
To really get what happened, we've got to start with the official story.
You know, the legend that's been passed down for centuries.
It's a great story for a movie, right? You had this mighty empire, and then bam, barbarian hordes at the gates. The shining city on a hill, its unstoppable legions holding the line against chaos. It's civilization versus savagery. Super easy to understand, and it's also completely wrong.
And this, right here, this flips the entire script. See, the myth, it points a finger out there, blaming foreign invaders for everything. But the reality, well, the reality that a mountain of evidence now supports, it points the finger right back at Rome itself. And that is a much more complex and, honestly, a much more terrifying story.
Okay, so if it was an inside job, where do you even start looking? Well, it didn't begin on some bloody battlefield. It started in the marketplace. The very first signs of this disease, they showed up in the empire's lifeblood, its money.
The weapon here wasn't a sword or a catapult. It was an economic policy. And it sounds kind of boring, but trust me, it's not. It's called currency debasement. And here's the gist. To pay for all their wars and fancy building projects, the emperors started secretly mixing cheaper metals into their silver and gold coins. So yeah, they could make more money, but every single coin was actually worth less. It was a classic short-term fix that led to total long-term disaster.
And this just set off a catastrophic chain reaction. Think about it. First, they debase the coins. Then, pretty quickly, people start to realize their money isn't worth what it used to be. Public trust? Gone. And when that trust disappears, sellers start demanding more and more coins for the same stuff. And just like that, you've got skyrocketing prices, what we call inflation. But here's the ultimate kicker. The state itself, the biggest spender of them all, suddenly couldn't even afford to pay its own soldiers. The very foundation of Roman power just started to crumble.
And if that wasn't bad enough, on top of this complete financial meltdown, a whole other crisis was brewing. Crippling labor shortages started to paralyze the entire empire. I mean, there just weren't enough people to farm the fields, to build the roads, to work in the shops. The mighty economic engine of Rome was grinding to a halt.
Yeah, this economic cancer, it didn't just stay in the economy. It spread, and it spread with terrifying speed. It infected the political heart of Rome, its military muscle, and the whole system just started to unravel.
And this is where things just spiral into pure chaos. Take a look at this period they call the crisis of the 3rd century. In 1 year, 238 AD, Rome had 6 different emperors. 6! Can you imagine? The throne basically became a death sentence. This wasn't a stable government. It was a non-stop, bloody civil war between power-hungry generals.
So, what do you think happens to an army when it stops getting paid and its leaders are being killed off left and right? You guessed it, a total military meltdown. Loyalty to Rome? That just evaporated. It was replaced by loyalty to whichever general could promise the most cash and loot. That legendary discipline of the Roman legions? Gone. And eventually things got so desperate that the state had to start hiring foreign mercenaries. Yep, the very barbarians from the old stories, just to defend its own borders.
All right, so let's take stock. The empire is completely hollowed out from the inside. It's economically broken, politically a total mess, and militarily fragile. It was like this giant, magnificent, but ultimately empty shell just waiting for one final push. And that push? Well, it came from 2 forces that were completely outside of anyone's control.
So just when Rome was at its absolute weakest, the world itself almost seemed to turn against it, delivering 2 final, devastating blows.
First up, disease. A series of absolutely horrific pandemics swept through the population. Modern estimates suggest they might have wiped out as much as 1/3 of the empire's people. Just let that sink in for a second. 1 out of every 3 people, gone. This was a demographic catastrophe that shattered communities and just made those labor shortages we talked about a million times worse.
And then the climate turned. A period of global cooling started. Now, an average temperature drop of 1.5 degrees Celsius might not sound like a lot to you and me, but for a society that lives and dies by its farms, it was an absolute disaster. It led to widespread crop failures, famine, and it drove desperate, starving people off their lands. The empire was literally being starved out.
So when you put all the pieces of this puzzle together, the bad money, the political chaos, the broken military, the plagues, the climate change, the final picture becomes horrifyingly clear. There's a quote from one of our sources that just nails it. It was a slow unraveling caused by a perfect storm of domestic crises. See, the fall of Rome wasn't some sudden event. It wasn't a conquest. It was a slow unraveling. It was a perfect storm where every single disaster just made all the others worse, creating this inescapable feedback loop of collapse.
So at the end of the day, here's what it comes down to. The real killers of Rome, they weren't barbarian hordes, they were systemic economic failure, chronic political instability, the decay of its own military, and these devastating environmental shocks that the weakened state just couldn't handle anymore. The invaders didn't knock the door down. They basically just walked through a door that was already rotting off its hinges.
And this is why this story is so important, why we have to get it right. Because the fall of Rome, it isn't just some dusty old piece of ancient history. It is a stark, powerful, and very modern cautionary tale.
And it forces us to ask ourselves a pretty tough question. When we look at the enormous challenges that we're facing today, economic fragility, deep political divisions, ecological instability, are we maybe too focused on the barbarians at the gates? Or are we ignoring the slow, steady cracking of the foundations right underneath our own feet?